Welcome, my friend. You found a quiet place to rest your thoughts. Tonight, I'll guide you through a story, gentle and slow, about one of the most influential figures in psychology, Abraham Maslow, a visionary who dared to study human excellence rather than human frailty. Someone who explored the mind, discovering the architecture of human needs and the heights of what we might become when those needs are met. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. If you enjoy these calm explorations of psychology and the human spirit, please like this video and subscribe for more bedtime lore. In the comments, share what you love most about the mind. Is it the mystery of dreams, the pull of emotion, or the depth of the soul? Your answer may shape where our next midnight voyage drifts. Now, let's begin a soft descent into the world of Abraham Maslow. Their questions, their discoveries, and their lifelong search to understand what stirs within us. On the first day of April in 1908, in the densely populated streets of Brooklyn, New York, a child was born who would one day ask the world to reconsider what it meant to be fully human. Abraham Harold Maslow entered a world of immigrant struggle, of tenement buildings crowded with families seeking the American dream, of pushcarts and Yiddish voices echoing through narrow streets where sunlight fell in thin slices between brownstone buildings. His parents, Samuel and Rose Maslow, had arrived from Russia, carrying with them the weight of the old world and the desperate hope of the new. Samuel was a cooper, a maker of barrels, whose hands knew the grain of wood and the necessity of hard labor. Rose was a woman shaped by survival, by the hardships that had marked her journey across an ocean and into a land that promised much but guaranteed nothing. They were the first generation, the ones who crossed over, and, like so many who made that crossing, they carried within them both ambition for their children and the psychological scars of their own deprivation. Abraham was the eldest of 7 children, and in this position, he bore the full weight of parental expectation. In the Jewish immigrant communities of early 20th century New York, education was seen as the golden ladder, the means by which one climbed out of poverty and into respectability. Books were sacred objects. Learning was not merely encouraged. It was demanded, insisted upon, woven into the very fabric of identity and hope. But young Abraham's childhood was not a happy one. This fact would later seem almost prophetic, as though his early suffering prepared him to understand the foundational needs of human beings in a way that a more comfortable childhood might not have permitted. He was, by his own later accounts, a profoundly lonely child, isolated, anxious. He described himself as neurotic, filled with self-doubt, and painfully shy. His relationship with his mother, in particular, cast a long shadow across his early years. Rose Maslow was, in her son's memory, a harsh woman, cold, rejecting. Abraham would later speak of her with a bitterness that never quite faded, even in his adult years when he had achieved professional success and personal insight. She was superstitious, he recalled, and cruel in ways both overt and subtle. There is a story he told, decades later, about his mother killing 2 stray cats that young Abraham had brought home, smashing their heads against a wall. The memory stayed with him, not just as a moment of childhood trauma, but as a symbol of something harder to name, a fundamental lack of warmth, of maternal acceptance, of that basic psychological safety that children need as much as food or shelter. He would say, much later in life, that he had hated her, strong words, unforgiving words. At her funeral, he did not weep. This absence of grief, this emotional void where mourning should have been, was itself significant. It spoke to a wound that had never healed, a need that had never been met. And perhaps in that unmet need, in that lack of maternal love and acceptance, the seeds were planted for his later fascination with what human beings require in order to flourish. His father, Samuel, was a different figure, less actively harmful, perhaps, but also largely absent in the ways that mattered emotionally. He was a man focused on survival, on providing, on the practical matters of keeping a large family housed and fed in an unforgiving city. There was little room for tenderness in such a life, little space for the emotional attunement that children crave. And so young Abraham retreated. He retreated into books, into the public library that became his sanctuary, into the world of ideas where he could be safe. The library was quiet. It asked nothing of him except attention. It judged him not at all. Among the stacks, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, he could breathe. He could be himself without fear. He was also acutely aware of his appearance. He saw himself as ugly, particularly his prominent nose, which became in his mind a focal point for his insecurities. In the harsh social hierarchies of childhood and adolescence, such perceived defects become magnified, transformed into reasons for exclusion, for shame. He felt different. He felt less than. And these feelings, too, would later inform his understanding of what human beings need, not just physical safety and food, but acceptance, belonging, esteem. The neighborhood where he grew up was not a gentle place. Brooklyn in those years was rough, divided along ethnic and economic lines, filled with the tensions that arise when too many people compete for too few resources. For a sensitive, bookish Jewish boy who saw himself as physically inadequate, it was often hostile territory. He learned to navigate it carefully, to make himself small, to avoid confrontation. These were survival strategies, adaptive responses to an environment that felt threatening. But there was something else growing in him too, beneath the anxiety and insecurity. There was a hunger, not just for physical safety or social acceptance, though he craved those things desperately, but for something more, a hunger to understand, a hunger to make sense of the world and of the inner turmoil he felt. Why did people behave as they did? What motivated them? What did it mean to live well, to be fully human? These questions began to form, quietly, in the mind of the lonely boy among his books. His intellectual gifts were evident early. Despite his emotional struggles, or perhaps partly because of them, he excelled academically. School was another kind of sanctuary, a place where his intelligence was recognized and valued, even if he himself felt unvalued. He graduated from Boys High School in Brooklyn, and in 1926 enrolled at the City College of New York, a public institution that had become a gateway to upward mobility for countless children of immigrants. At first, he studied law, following the practical, respectable path that his father urged upon him. But his heart was not in it. Law was about rules, about precedents, about the machinery of society. It did not speak to the questions that burned within him. After a short time, he abandoned legal studies and turned instead toward psychology, a field that was still relatively young, still defining itself, still wild with possibility. This was the late, 1,920 seconds. And psychology was a discipline caught between competing visions. There was the behaviorism of John Watson, which sought to make psychology a rigorous science by focusing exclusively on observable behavior, dismissing consciousness and inner experience as unscientific and irrelevant. There was the psychoanalysis of Freud, which delved deep into the unconscious mind, into dreams and symbols, and the dark drives that supposedly governed human behavior. And there were other approaches, less dominant but still present, that tried to chart a middle course or explore different territories altogether. Abraham transferred to the University of Wisconsin at Madison for his graduate studies, leaving behind the crowded streets of Brooklyn for the open spaces of the Midwest. This move was significant in multiple ways. Geographically, it represented an expansion of his world, an escape from the confines of his difficult childhood environment. Intellectually, it placed him in contact with new ideas and mentors who would shape his development. And personally, it coincided with another transformative event: his marriage to his first cousin, Bertha Goodman. Bertha and Abraham had known each other since childhood. She was, by his own account, the first person who truly loved him, who saw value in him, who made him feel worthy. This experience of being loved, of being accepted fully by another person, was psychologically profound for someone who had felt so rejected and inadequate throughout his formative years. It gave him a taste of what he would later call belonging and love needs, that deep human requirement for connection, for being seen and valued by others. Their marriage, which lasted until his death decades later, provided him with a secure base from which he could explore the world. It was, in many ways, a corrective emotional experience, a relationship that helped heal some of the wounds of his childhood. Bertha believed in him when he did not fully believe in himself. She supported his intellectual ambitions even when they led to financial uncertainty. And in the stability of their bond, he found the psychological safety necessary to take risks, to pursue unconventional ideas, to challenge the prevailing orthodoxies of his field. At Wisconsin, he worked with Harry Harlow, who would later become famous for his studies of attachment in rhesus monkeys, those heartbreaking experiments where infant monkeys chose the soft, cloth-covered surrogate mother over the wire, mother that provided food, demonstrating that the need for comfort and contact was as fundamental as the need for nourishment. Though Maslow worked with Harlow before those particular studies, the underlying interest in what motivates behavior beyond simple survival was already present in that laboratory. Maslow's own research at Wisconsin focused on primate behavior and sexuality. He studied dominance hierarchies in monkeys, observing how social structures emerged and how they affected individual behavior. This work was empirical, observational, grounded in the careful study of animal behavior. It was good science, according to the standards of the time. But even then, even in those early years of his career, Maslow was interested in questions that went beyond the immediate data. He was watching monkeys, but he was thinking about humans. He was observing dominance hierarchies, but he was wondering about human motivation, about what drives us, about what we need. He completed his PhD in 1934 during the depths of the Great Depression. The world was in crisis. Millions were unemployed, hungry, desperate. The social order seemed to be fracturing. In Europe, dark political movements were rising. In America, there was widespread suffering and a pervasive sense of uncertainty about the future. Into this troubled world, the young Dr. Maslow emerged with his doctorate, his brilliant mind, and his unresolved questions about human nature. After graduation, he returned to New York, where he secured a position at Brooklyn College. He would remain there for many years, teaching and continuing his research. And it was in New York, in that vibrant, tumultuous city, that his thinking began to shift in the directions that would eventually make him famous. New York in the late 1930s and early 1940s was an extraordinary intellectual environment. The rise of fascism in Europe had driven many of the continent's greatest thinkers to America, and many of them settled in New York. The city became a kind of refuge for displaced intellectuals, a gathering place for minds that had been forced to flee their homelands. And young Abraham Maslow, teaching at Brooklyn College, found himself with unprecedented access to some of the most brilliant psychologists and social scientists of the era. He encountered and studied with figures like Max Wertheimer, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology, who emphasized the importance of perceiving wholes rather than just collections of parts. Wertheimer was interested in insight, in understanding, in the sudden reorganization of perception that leads to genuine comprehension. This was different from the behaviorist focus on conditioning and incremental learning. It suggested that the mind was active, creative, capable of genuine understanding rather than merely responding to stimuli. Maslow also encountered Alfred Adler, the former colleague of Freud, who had broken with the SPA, psychoanalytic movement, to develop his own approach. Adler emphasized social interest, the human need for community and contribution. He believed that much of human psychology could be understood in terms of our striving for significance, for overcoming feelings of inferiority, for finding our place in the social world. This resonated with Maslow's own experience of feeling inferior and his yearning for something more. And then there was Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, the cultural anthropologists who were demonstrating that human nature was far more flexible and culturally shaped than many psychologists assumed. They showed that personality, gender roles, aggression, cooperation, all the things that seemed to be fixed aspects of human nature varied dramatically across cultures. This suggested that human beings had vast potential for different ways of being, that we were not locked into narrow, predetermined patterns. These encounters were formative. They expanded Maslow's sense of what psychology could be. Here were thinkers who did not reduce human beings to stimulus-response mechanisms or to seething cauldrons of unconscious drives. Here were people studying insight, creativity, culture, meaning, the higher aspects of human functioning. And Maslow found himself drawn to these questions, to this more expansive vision of what psychology might explore. But there was something else happening during these years, something that would prove equally important to his intellectual development. The world was at war. The Second World War raged across Europe and the Pacific, bringing death and destruction on an unprecedented scale. Maslow, watching the newsreels, reading the reports, confronting the horror of what human beings were capable of doing to one another, felt a deep sense of urgency about the questions his field was asking. Psychology, as it was currently practiced, seemed to him profoundly limited. Behaviorism studied rats in mazes and pigeons, pecking at keys, deriving laws of learning that told us nothing about human meaning, purpose, or potential. Psychoanalysis focused on neurosis, on pathology, on the dark drives and conflicts that supposedly governed human behavior. Both approaches, in their different ways, offered what Maslow saw as a diminished, partial vision of what it meant to be human. Where was the psychology of human health? Where was the study of excellence, of creativity, of joy? Where was the investigation of what human beings might become under optimal conditions? Psychology seemed obsessed with illness, with pathology, with what went wrong. But what about what went right? What about people who were not just free from mental illness, but actually flourishing, actualizing their potential, living lives of meaning and purpose? These questions crystallized in Maslow's mind during the war years. He later said that he had a kind of vision, watching a parade celebrating the end of the war. He saw the crowds celebrating, saw the relief and joy, and he felt, with sudden clarity, that he wanted to dedicate his life to developing a psychology that could help prevent future wars, that could help human beings realize their better nature, that could contribute to a world less characterized by violence and more by cooperation and mutual flourishing. This was an ambitious goal, perhaps a grandiose one, but it gave his work direction and moral weight. He was not just pursuing academic questions for their own sake. He was trying to contribute to human welfare, to peace, to the realization of human potential. Psychology, in his emerging vision, should be not just a descriptive science, but a transformative one. It should help us become better than we are. In the early 1942, Abraham Maslow began developing the theory that would make him famous, the idea that would seep into popular culture and influence fields far beyond psychology. He began to articulate what he called a hierarchy of human needs. The core insight was deceptively simple. Human beings have needs, requirements that must be met for us to survive and to thrive. But these needs are not all of the same type, and they are not all equally urgent. They arrange themselves into a hierarchy, with more basic, fundamental needs forming a foundation upon which higher needs rest. Imagine, if you will, a pyramid. This geometric form would later become the standard way of representing Maslow's hierarchy, though he himself never drew it that way in his original papers. But the pyramid works as a metaphor because it captures something essential about the structure he described. The base of the pyramid is wide and sturdy, representing the most fundamental needs. As we move upward, the pyramid narrows, representing needs that are more sophisticated, more distinctly human, but also more fragile, more easily disrupted if the foundation beneath them is unstable. At the very bottom, forming the foundation of the entire structure, are the physiological needs. These are the requirements of the body itself. The need for food, for water, for air to breathe. The need for sleep, for shelter from the elements, for warmth when it is cold. The need for basic physical comfort, for the regulation of bodily states. These are the needs we share with all living creatures. They are the most urgent because their absence leads most quickly to death. A person who is starving thinks about food. Their attention narrows to that one overwhelming requirement. Everything else fades into the background. The starving person does not contemplate art or philosophy or self-fulfillment. They think about food. They dream about food. Their entire being is organized around the desperate need to acquire sustenance. This is not a moral failing or a lack of imagination. It is simply the reality of biological need. The body will not be ignored. Its requirements must be met first. Once the physiological needs are reasonably well satisfied, note that Maslow did not require perfect satisfaction, only reasonable fulfillment. Then the next level of needs emerges into awareness and begins to motivate behavior. These are the safety needs. The need for physical safety, for security, for protection from harm. The need for stability, for predictability, for a world that is not constantly threatening. The need for order, for law, for structures that protect us from chaos and violence. These too are fundamental. A person living in constant fear, in an environment of chronic threat, cannot easily think about higher concerns. Their energy is devoted to staying alive, to avoiding danger, to creating whatever sense of security they can. Think of a child growing up in a war zone, where bombs might fall at any moment. Think of someone living in an abusive household, never knowing when the next explosion of violence will occur. Think of the profound insecurity of homelessness, of having no stable place to be, of being always vulnerable. When safety needs are not met, they dominate consciousness. The world becomes a threatening place, and survival becomes the organizing principle of life. But when safety needs are met, when a person has reasonable security and stability, then once again, a new set of needs emerges. These are the belonging and love needs, sometimes called social needs. Human beings are social creatures. We need connection. We need to belong to groups, to families, to communities. We need friendship, affection, intimacy. We need to feel that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that we have a place in the social world, that we are not alone. The absence of these connections is painful. Loneliness is not just an inconvenience. It is a deep wound. Exclusion, rejection, isolation. These are among the most painful experiences human beings can endure. Maslow understood this from his own experience. He had felt the pain of isolation in his childhood, the sense of being unwanted, of not belonging. And he had felt the healing power of connection when Bertha loved him, when he found intellectual community, when he experienced genuine belonging. The need for connection is not a luxury or a preference. It is a fundamental requirement of human psychology. When belonging needs are met, when a person has satisfying relationships and a sense of social connection, then yet another level of needs emerges. These are the esteem needs, which come in two related but distinguishable forms. First, there is the need for esteem from others, for respect, for recognition, for status, and prestige. We want to be valued by our community. We want our contributions to be acknowledged. We want to be seen as competent, as worthy, as deserving of respect. This is not mere vanity, though it can take vain forms. It is a deep human need to have our worth recognized by others. But there is also a second, perhaps even more important, form of esteem need, self-esteem. The need to respect, to ourselves, to feel competent and confident, to have a sense of mastery and adequacy. This internal sense of worth is crucial. It cannot be entirely dependent on external validation, though external recognition can support it. We need to feel that we are capable, that we can handle challenges, that we have value. When esteem needs are frustrated, when we are constantly belittled, when our efforts are dismissed, when we feel incompetent or worthless, it damages us profoundly. But when these needs are met, when we have both self-respect and respect from others, then we stand on solid psychological ground. We have our basic physiological needs met. We have safety and security. We have love and belonging. We have esteem and recognition. And it is only now, Maslow argued, only when all of these foundational needs are reasonably well satisfied, that the highest need can emerge and begin to organize our behavior. This is the need he called self-actualization. Self-actualization is different in kind from the needs below it. The lower needs, from physiological through esteem, are what Maslow called deficiency needs, or D needs. They arise from a lack, from something missing. We need food because we lack it. We need safety because we are threatened. We need belonging because we are isolated. We need esteem because we feel inadequate. These needs are about filling holes, about making up deficits, about getting what we lack. But self-actualization is not a deficiency need. It is what Maslow called a being need or growth need. It is not about filling a lack, but about becoming what we have the potential to become. It is about actualizing our capacities, developing our talents, expressing our true nature, becoming fully ourselves. Maslow struggled to define self-actualization precisely, perhaps because it is, by its nature, unique to each individual. Self-actualization for a poet might mean writing poetry that expresses their deepest truth. Self-actualization for a mother might mean raising her children with love and wisdom. Self-actualization for a scientist might mean pursuing knowledge wherever it leads. The specific content varies from person to person because each of us has different potentials, different talents, different callings. But there are common features. Self-actualizing behavior is freely chosen rather than compelled by deficiency. It is intrinsically motivated rather than done for external reward. It involves using our capacities to their fullest. It means becoming, in Maslow's words, everything that one is capable of becoming. There is a famous quotation that captures this. A musician must make music. An artist must paint. A poet must write, if he is to be ultimately at peace with himself. What a man can be, he must be. This hierarchy, this architecture of human needs, was Maslow's most influential contribution to psychology. It provided a framework for understanding human motivation that was more nuanced than simple. Behaviorist accounts, and more optimistic than the psychoanalytic focus on pathology. It suggested that human beings are not just pushed by drives or conditioned by rewards and punishments, but pulled toward growth, toward the realization of potential. But Maslow was careful to note that the hierarchy is not rigid. It is not the case that one must completely satisfy each level before moving to the next. Rather, the levels overlap. We can work towards self-actualization even while some lower needs remain partially unmet. The hierarchy describes general tendencies and priorities rather than absolute rules. Moreover, Maslow recognized that there are individual differences. For some people, the order might be different. A starving artist might sacrifice physiological comfort for creative expression. A martyr might give up safety for a higher cause. But these exceptions, Maslow argued, do not invalidate the general pattern. They're variations on the theme, not refutations of it. He also recognized that needs can be temporarily frustrated without catastrophic consequences. We can go hungry for a day without losing our capacity for self-actualization. We can experience temporary loneliness without being fundamentally damaged. The hierarchy describes chronic patterns, the general organization of human motivation over time, not moment-to-moment fluctuations. And importantly, Maslow understood that the social and economic environment profoundly affects whether people can satisfy their needs. A society characterized by widespread poverty will have many people stuck at the physiological level, struggling just to survive. A society marked by violence and instability will have many people unable to move beyond safety concerns. A society that is atomized and individualistic might leave many people lonely, unable to satisfy belonging needs. And a society that values conformity and material success above all else might make it difficult for people to pursue genuine self-actualization. Thus, his hierarchy was not just a theory of individual psychology. It has social and political implications. It suggested that if we want human beings to flourish, to actualize their potential, we must create social conditions that allow their basic needs to be met. We must ensure that people have food, shelter, safety, community, and opportunity for meaningful work. This was, in its own way, a radical idea. It suggested that social reform and psychological health were intimately connected. During the 1940 seconds and early 1950 seconds, Maslow developed and refined these ideas. He published papers with titles like A Theory of Human Motivation in 1943, laying out the hierarchy in detail. He was building a new framework, a new way of thinking about human nature that emphasized growth rather than just deficit reduction, health rather than just the absence of illness. But he was not content with theory alone. He wanted to study self-actualizing people directly. If self-actualization was the highest level of human development, what were self-actualizing people actually like? What characteristics did they share? How did they live? What could we learn from studying excellence rather than pathology? This question led him to one of his most distinctive contributions, the study of self-actualizing individuals. In the late 1940 seconds and early 1950 seconds, Abraham Maslow undertook a project that was unusual, perhaps even unprecedented, in academic psychology. He decided to study psychologically healthy, self-actualizing people to understand what human beings could be at their best. This was methodologically controversial. How does one identify self-actualizing people? By what criteria? And how can one study them scientifically? Maslow's approach was more qualitative and intuitive than most psychologists would accept today. He began by identifying people he personally knew or knew of who seemed to him to be self-actualizing. He supplemented these with historical figures who, based on biographical evidence, seemed to fit the criteria. His initial sample included people like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Jane Addams, and Spinoza. He also included some contemporaries whom he knew personally, though he kept their identities anonymous in his writings. The sample was small, and the selection process was subjective. This was not a carefully controlled, experimental study. It was more like a naturalistic observation, a qualitative exploration of what healthy human functioning looks like at its highest levels. But from this study, Maslow derived a remarkably consistent set of characteristics that self-actualizing people seem to share. These characteristics painted a picture of human excellence that was quite different from the usual concerns of psychology. First, self-actualizing people had an unusually efficient perception of reality. They saw things as they were rather than as they wished them to be. They were not defensive in their perception. not constantly distorting reality to protect their ego or maintain their illusions. They could tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty. They could perceive the truth about themselves, about others, about situations, even when that truth was uncomfortable. This capacity for realistic perception extended to their ability to detect fakeness and dishonesty in others. They had good judgment about people. They could see through pretense and manipulation, not because they were cynical, but because they were clear-eyed. They did not need to distort reality, so they saw it more accurately. Second, self-actualizing people had a high degree of acceptance of themselves, of others, and of nature. They were not crippled by guilt or shame about their own nature. They accepted their bodily functions, their desires, their imperfections without excessive concern. This did not mean they were complacent or that they never worked to improve themselves, but they started from a place of fundamental self-acceptance rather than self-rejection. Similarly, they accepted others as they were. They did not have a compulsive need to change people, to fix them, to make them conform to some ideal. They could appreciate people in their individuality and specificity, and they accepted the natural world, the reality of existence, without demanding that it be other than it is. They did not waste energy raging against the inevitable or pining for a perfect world. They worked with what was. Third, self-actualizing people had a quality of spontaneity and simplicity. Their behavior flowed naturally from their inner nature. They were not constantly performing, not always wearing masks, not hiding behind elaborate social facades. They could be themselves. This spontaneity was most evident in their inner life, in their thoughts and impulses, but it also showed in their behavior when the situation allowed. They were not impulsive or reckless, but they were genuine. Fourth, they were problem-centered rather than self-centered. Self-actualizing people had a mission, a calling, a task to which they devoted themselves. They had work to do in the world, problems to solve that were larger than their personal concerns. This gave their lives direction and meaning. They were not constantly focused on themselves, on their own feelings and needs. They looked outward, engaging with challenges that they found important and worthwhile. This problem-centeredness was connected to another characteristic, a sense of duty or responsibility. Self-actualizing people felt called to their work. They took their tasks seriously. They had a sense that they were supposed to be doing what they were doing, that it mattered. This was not a grim, joyless sense of obligation, but rather a feeling that they had found their place, their role, their contribution. Fifth, self-actualizing people had a quality of detachment and a need for privacy. They could be alone without being lonely. In fact, they needed solitude, needed time to themselves. They were not dependent on others for their sense of well-being. They were autonomous, self-contained, capable of functioning from their own inner resources. This made them sometimes seem aloof or remote to others, but it was not coldness. It was self-sufficiency. This autonomy extended to their relationship with culture. Self-actualizing people were independent of their culture in many ways. They did not simply conform to social norms and expectations. They could stand outside their culture, observe it, critique it, choose which aspects to embrace and which to reject. They were not rebels for the sake of rebellion, but they were not conventional either. They thought for themselves. Sixth, self-actualizing people had a continued freshness of appreciation. They could experience the world with wonder. A sunset, a flower, a piece of music, a child's laugh, these could move them deeply, even if they had experienced them many times before. They did not become jaded or bored with life. They retained a capacity for awe and gratitude. Life remained interesting, even miraculous, to them. Related to this was their capacity for what Maslow called peak experiences. Intense, transcendent moments of joy, insight, or connection that we will explore more deeply shortly. But the freshness of appreciation was an everyday quality, a general openness to the wonder of existence. Seventh, self-actualizing people often reported mystical experiences or oceanic feelings, moments of feeling connected to all of existence, of experiencing unity with the cosmos, of transcending ordinary ego boundaries. This was not universal among them, and Maslow noted that not all self-actualizing people were particularly mystical, but many reported such experiences, and they valued them highly. Eighth, self-actualizing people had deep feelings of identification, sympathy, and affection for humanity in general. Maslow called this Gemeinschaftsgefühl, borrowing Adler's term for social feeling or community feeling. They cared about human welfare. They wanted to help. They felt a kinship with humanity as a whole, even while often being frustrated or disappointed by specific individuals. They had, in a sense, a love for humankind. Ninth, self-actualizing people had deep, profound interpersonal relationships. They did not have many close relationships. They were often selective about whom they let into their inner circle, but the relationships they did have were deep, authentic, and intimate. They could be fully themselves with these chosen others, and they engaged in genuinely mutual, caring connections. Their capacity for love was great, though not promiscuously distributed. 10th, self-actualizing people had democratic character structures. By this, Maslow meant that they respected all people regardless of class, education, race, or status. They could learn from anyone. They were humble in the sense that they recognized that wisdom and worth were not limited to certain categories of people. They could be friendly with a janitor or a PhD, finding value in both. They judged people by character rather than by credentials. 11th, self-actualizing people had a strong sense of ethics. They had clear values, a clear sense of right and wrong. They were not morally confused or relativistic, but their ethics were not conventional or borrowed unthinkingly from their culture. They had thought through their values, and they lived by them. They were unlikely to engage in cruelty, dishonesty, or exploitation. They were, in a word, good people. 12th, self-actualizing people had an unhostile sense of humor. They did not laugh at cruel jokes or find amusement in others' suffering. Their humor was philosophical rather than hostile. They could laugh at human foolishness, including their own. They could see the cosmic joke, the absurdity of existence, and find it funny rather than tragic. But their laughter did not diminish or demean. It was kind. 13th, self-actualizing people were creative. This did not necessarily mean they were artists or inventors, though some were. But they had a creative attitude toward life. They were original in their perceptions, flexible in their thinking, able to see new possibilities. They brought creativity to whatever they did, whether it was cooking a meal, solving a problem, or raising a child. Their creativity was a way of being rather than a specific talent. And finally, 14th, self-actualizing people resisted enculturation. They did not simply absorb their culture's values without examination. They could maintain a critical distance, could question assumptions, could resist conformity. They were not countercultural in a reactive sense, but they were not conventional either. They transcended their culture without necessarily rejecting it entirely. This portrait of self-actualizing people is striking in multiple ways. First, it is remarkably positive. These are people who are functioning well, who are healthy, who are realizing their potential. This was a radical contrast to most of psychology, which focused on what was wrong with people. Second, the portrait is holistic. Self-actualization is not just one trait, but a whole constellation of characteristics that fit together. It is a way of being in the world that encompasses perception, values, relationships, creativity, and spirituality. Third, the portrait is humanistic. Self-actualizing people are not superhuman or perfect. Maslow noted that they had flaws and could be stubborn, irritating, or cold at times, but they had developed their capacities more fully than most people. They were what human beings could be under favorable conditions. And fourth, the portrait is rare. Maslow estimated that only a small percentage of the population, perhaps 1 or 2%, were truly self-actualizing. This was not because most people were incapable of it, but because the social conditions and personal circumstances necessary for self-actualization were not widely available. Most people were still struggling with lower needs, still caught up in deficiency motivation rather than growth motivation. This last point is crucial. Maslow did not see self-actualization as an achievement that one could simply will into being through effort. It depended on having one's lower needs met. It depended on having psychological health established. It depended on social and economic conditions that freed one from constant struggle and allowed for growth. In this sense, the study of self-actualizing people was also implicitly a critique of society. It asked, why are so few people reaching their potential? What prevents this? What would a society look like that facilitated self-actualization more broadly? These questions would occupy Maslow increasingly in the later decades of his career, leading him toward social psychology, organizational theory, and eventually toward transpersonal psychology and the study of the farther reaches of human nature. But in the 1,950 seconds, he was primarily focused on articulating his vision of humanistic psychology and studying the characteristics of health rather than pathology. And central to the study was his investigation of peak experiences, those extraordinary moments when human beings touch something transcendent. In the mid-1,950 seconds, Abraham Maslow began to focus intensively on a phenomenon that had captured his attention during his studies of self-actualizing people. Many of them had described moments of extraordinary experience, moments of intense joy, insight, connection, or transcendence, moments when the world seemed to open up, when ordinary perception gave way to something more profound, when they felt profoundly alive, connected, and fulfilled. Maslow called these peak experiences, and he devoted considerable energy to studying them, collecting descriptions, analyzing their characteristics, and understanding their place in human psychology. The term peak experience is now common in our language, having passed from technical psychological vocabulary into everyday speech. But Maslow gave it a specific meaning, a carefully considered definition based on his interviews and studies. A peak experience, as Maslow described it, is a moment of highest happiness and fulfillment. It is a temporary experience, not a permanent state, but while it lasts, it profoundly alters consciousness. During a peak experience, a person feels a sense of wholeness, integration, and unity. The usual sense of separation between self and world diminishes. There is a feeling of connection to everything, of being part of a larger whole. Peak experiences are accompanied by intense positive emotions, joy, ecstasy, rapture, bliss. There is a sense of wonder and awe. The experience feels precious, even sacred. It is often described as one of the most important moments of a person's life, something they return to in memory again and again. During a peak experience, perception becomes especially vivid and rich. Colors seem brighter, sounds more beautiful, sensations more intense. There is a quality of fascination, of complete absorption in the moment. The person is fully present, fully engaged, not thinking about the past or future, but entirely immersed in now. Time perception often changes. Some people report that time seems to stop or that the experience exists outside of time. Others report that time passes very quickly without their noticing. The usual sense of time as a flowing sequence of moments gives way to something different, a sense of eternity or timelessness. Peak experiences often bring insights. There is a sense of understanding, of seeing into the nature of things. These insights might be about oneself, about other people, about the nature of reality. They feel like revelations, like suddenly seeing the truth. Often, the insights are difficult to put into words, but they feel profoundly significant. There is also a sense of transcendence during peak experiences. The person feels lifted beyond ordinary concerns, beyond petty ego needs, beyond the usual anxieties and conflicts. There is a feeling of freedom, of release, of being unencumbered. The small self, with all its worries and defenses, seems to dissolve, and something larger emerges. Peak experiences often have a poetic quality. People describing them use metaphors of light, music, dancing, flowing. They speak of harmony, beauty, perfection. The experience itself seems to exist in a realm where the aesthetic and the spiritual merge, where truth and beauty are one. And importantly, peak experiences leave lasting effects. Even though they are temporary, they change the person. They provide a glimpse of what life can be at its highest. They offer evidence that existence is fundamentally good, that there is meaning and beauty in the world. They are, in Maslow's words, validating experiences. They validate our existence, our worth, the value of being alive. Maslow identified many different triggers for peak experiences. They could occur during moments of great natural beauty, watching a sunset, standing on a mountaintop, walking through a forest. They could occur during aesthetic experiences, listening to music, looking at a painting, reading poetry. They could occur during moments of intimacy, making love, giving birth, holding one's child. They could occur during creative work, during athletic performance, during intellectual insight, during religious or mystical experience. What these diverse triggers had in common was that they involved full engagement, complete presence, a moment of losing oneself in something that one values highly. The trigger itself mattered less than the quality of engagement and the person's openness to the experience. Maslow found that self-actualizing people had more frequent peak experiences than others, though he also noted that nearly everyone has had at least a few such moments. Self-actualizing people seemed more open to these experiences, more able to let go of ego defenses, more capable of full absorption. But peak experiences were not limited to an elite few. They were a natural part of human consciousness, available to anyone under the right circumstances. He also noted that some self-actualizing people, whom he called merely healthy, were not particularly prone to peak experiences. They were functioning well, meeting their potential, living good lives, but they were more grounded, more practical, less mystical. They did not often have transcendent experiences, and they did not particularly miss them. Their self-actualization took a more earthbound form, but others, whom he called transcendent self-actualizers, seemed to live with one foot in the transcendent realm. They had frequent peak experiences, and these experiences were central to their sense of meaning and purpose. They often became teachers, artists, mystics, or spiritual guides, trying to help others access these higher states of consciousness. This distinction was important to Maslow because it showed that there were different paths to self-actualization, different ways of being fully human. Not everyone needed to be mystical to be fully themselves, but for those who were called in that direction, mystical experience was not pathological or escapist. It was a genuine expression of human potential. Maslow's study of peak experiences led him to several important conclusions. First, it convinced him that human nature includes a need for transcendence, for experiences that go beyond ordinary, everyday consciousness. We need these moments of elevation, these glimpses of something greater. They are not luxuries or indulgences, but part of what it means to be fully human. Second, it reinforced his critique of reductionistic psychology. If you studied only deficits, only pathology, only problems, you would never discover peak experiences. You would never understand this dimension of human consciousness. You needed to study health, excellence, the best moments of life to get a complete picture of human nature. Third, it suggested that many of the experiences traditionally associated with religion, mystical experiences, feelings of unity, encounters with the sacred, were natural psychological phenomena. They did not require belief in supernatural entities or adherence to particular doctrines. They were part of human potential, accessible through purely natural means. This last point was particularly important to Maslow. He saw peak experiences as providing a naturalistic account of religious experience. Religion, in his view, had originally been rooted in the genuine peak experiences of prophets, mystics, and founders. These were real experiences, powerful and transformative. But then religious institutions had taken these experiences and codified them into dogmas, rituals, and organizational structures. The original experience was lost or hidden beneath layers of tradition and theology. Maslow called the people who had the original experiences peakers, and he suggested that a naturalistic, experiential spirituality based on peak experiences could provide meaning and transcendence without the dogmatism and divisiveness that often characterized organized religion. He imagined a kind of humanistic religion, grounded in actual experience rather than in authority or tradition. This was a controversial idea, and it put him at odds with both traditional religious believers, who saw him as reducing the sacred to psychology, and with secular materialists, who saw him as being soft-headed and unscientific for taking such experiences seriously at all. But Maslow believed he was charting a middle course, one that honored the reality and importance of transcendent experience, while understanding it as a natural human capacity rather than a supernatural intervention. As Maslow studied peak experiences, he also became aware of their opposite. If there were peaks, there were also valleys, moments when life seemed meaningless, when existence felt empty or threatening. He came to understand that the absence of peak experiences, the inability to access transcendent moments, could contribute to a sense of alienation, despair, and meaninglessness. Modern, secular, materialistic culture, he worried, provided few opportunities for legitimate peak experiences. Traditional sources, religion, ritual, nature, community, had been weakened or lost. People lived atomized lives, focused on consumption and achievement, without access to those moments of transcendence that make life feel meaningful. This, he believed, was a significant cause of the existential malaise that characterized modern life. He saw his work on peak experiences as part of a larger project of recovering the sacred in a secular project. Age. Not by returning to traditional religion with its supernatural claims and dogmatic structures, but by recognizing and cultivating the natural human capacity for transcendence, for meaning, for experiences of the sacred that arise from our own deepest nature rather than from external authority. This line of thinking would eventually lead him toward what became known as transpersonal psychology, the study of experiences and states of consciousness that transcend the ordinary personal self. But before we follow him into those farther reaches, we need to understand how his ideas about human needs and potential began to be applied in practical contexts, particularly in the world of work and organizations. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Abraham Maslow's ideas were gaining influence beyond academic psychology. His books, Motivation and Personality, 1954, and Toward a Psychology of Being, 1962, were widely read. His hierarchy of needs was being taught in psychology courses across the country, and increasingly, people outside of psychology were becoming interested in his work, particularly people concerned with how to create better organizations, better workplaces, better social structures. Maslow himself was interested in practical applications. He did not want to remain purely in the realm of theory. He wanted to see his ideas about human nature and human potential translated into real-world practices that could improve people's lives. In 1962, an unusual opportunity arose. Andrew Kay, the founder of Nonlinear Systems, a company that manufactured electronic instruments, invited Maslow to spend a summer studying his company. Kay was interested in humanistic management practices, in treating workers as whole human beings rather than as interchangeable parts in a machine. He wanted to know if Maslow's theories about human needs and self-actualization could inform how to run a business. Maslow accepted, and that summer he spent time observing the company, talking with workers and managers, thinking about how organizations could be structured to facilitate human growth and potential, rather than merely extracting productivity. The experience led to a book, originally published as Eusikian Management and later reissued as Maslow on management. The term psyche comes from the Greek and means something like good soul or good mind. Maslow used it to refer to an ideal society, a culture organized around psychological health and human growth. Psyche management, then, was management practices designed to facilitate human development and well-being rather than simply maximizing profits. The core idea was straightforward. If human beings have needs arranged in a hierarchy, and if people are most productive and satisfied when they are working toward self-actualization, then organizations should be designed to help people meet their needs and realize their potential. This was good not only for the workers, but also for the organization, because people who are psychologically healthy, who feel valued and engaged, who are working toward meaningful goals, will be more creative, more committed, and more productive. This was a radical idea in the context of mid-20th century management theory. The prevailing view, derived from Frederick Taylor's scientific management and similar approaches, saw workers as primarily motivated by money and needing to be closely controlled and supervised. Workers were assumed to be lazy, to need to be coerced or incentivized to work, to have no real interest in their work beyond the paycheck it provided. Maslow's approach suggested something entirely different. People wanted to work, he argued. They wanted to be productive, to contribute, to use their capacities, but they could only do so when their lower needs were met and when the work itself was meaningful and engaging. If you created conditions where people felt safe, where they were treated with respect, where they belonged to a genuine community, where their contributions were recognized, and where the work itself allowed for creativity and growth, then people would flourish, and the organization would flourish with them. He offered specific suggestions. Organizations should ensure that basic needs are met: adequate pay, safe working conditions, job security. These are not luxuries, but necessities. If workers are worried about paying rent or feeding their families, they cannot focus on higher-level needs. Organizations should foster a sense of community and belonging. People should feel that they are part of a team, that they matter, that their colleagues care about them. Social isolation at work is damaging. People need connection. Organizations should provide recognition and opportunities for esteem. People's contributions should be acknowledged. They should be given respect. They should have opportunities to develop mastery and feel competent. Arbitrary authority and unnecessary controls should be minimized because they undermine autonomy and self-respect. And crucially, organizations should provide opportunities for meaningful, challenging work that allows people to use their talents and develop their capacities. Work should not be mindlessly repetitive or utterly controlled. People should have some autonomy, some opportunity for creativity, some sense that their work matters. Maslow also argued that organizations should be structured in relatively flat, democratic ways. Rigid hierarchies, excessive bureaucracy, and authoritarian management styles were not only morally problematic, but also inefficient. They prevented the free flow of information, stifled creativity, and alienated workers. Better to have more participatory structures where people at all levels could contribute ideas and exercise judgment. These ideas resonated with many managers and organizational theorists, particularly as the 1,960 seconds unfolded and traditional authority structures were being questioned in many areas of society. Maslow's work provided a theoretical foundation for what would become known as humanistic management or human potential management. But Maslow was also clear-eyed about the limitations and challenges. He knew that not all work could be intrinsically meaningful. Someone had to collect garbage, wash dishes, do repetitive tasks. He did not romanticize labor or pretend that all work was inherently fulfilling. And he knew that economic pressures often forced organizations into practices that were not psychologically healthy because they needed to survive in competitive markets. He also recognized that not all people were ready for autonomy and self-direction. If someone's lower needs were unmet, if they came from a background of deprivation and insecurity, they might initially need more structure and direction. You could not simply impose freedom on people who were not psychologically prepared for it. The move toward self-actualization was a developmental process that required certain preconditions. Still, he believed that the general direction was clear. Organizations should strive to create conditions that facilitate human growth. This was not just an ethical imperative, but a practical one. The future belonged to organizations that could harness human creativity and commitment, and that required treating people as whole human beings with complex needs and vast potential. Maslow's work on organizational theory was part of a broader movement that emerged in the 1960 seconds, often called the human potential movement. This movement encompassed many different strands, encounter groups, sensitivity training, personal growth workshops, alternative education, and various therapies aimed at facilitating self-actualization. The Esalen Institute, founded in 1962 inches Big Sur, California, became a center of this movement. Esalen offered workshops and programs designed to help people explore their potential, access peak experiences, and become more fully themselves. Maslow was associated with Esalen, though he had some ambivalence about aspects of the movement. He appreciated the emphasis on growth and potential, on experience and self-exploration. He valued the movement's critique of conventional society and its vision of what human beings could become. But he also worried about excesses. He was concerned that some aspects of the movement were anti-intellectual, dismissing rigorous thinking in favor of pure experience. He worried about narcissism, about people becoming so focused on their own feelings and growth that they lost sight of larger responsibilities and commitments. He was particularly critical of what he saw as a kind of magical thinking in some corners of the movement, the idea that you could simply affirm your potential or visualize your goals and thereby achieve them without the hard work of actually developing skills, overcoming obstacles, and dealing with reality. Self-actualization, in his view, was not something you achieved by affirming it or attending a workshop. It was a lifelong process of growth that required meeting your lower needs, developing your capacities, engaging with real challenges, and contributing to something beyond yourself. Still, he remained broadly supportive of the movement's goals and saw his own work as contributing to a larger transformation in how society understood human nature and human possibilities. He believed that the 20th century was witnessing a profound shift away from older, more pessimistic views of human nature and toward a more optimistic, growth-oriented understanding. And he wanted psychology to be part of that shift, to provide scientific grounding for a vision of human potential that had previously been articulated mainly by artists, mystics, and philosophers. As the 1960 seconds progressed, Maslow's thinking continued to evolve. He remained interested in self-actualization, but increasingly his attention turned to experiences and states of consciousness that seemed to transcend even self-actualization, that pointed towards something beyond the individual self altogether. This led him into what would be called transpersonal psychology, the exploration of the farther reaches of human nature. In the late 1960s, during the final years of his life, Abraham Maslow began to articulate ideas that went beyond his earlier work on self-actualization. He became increasingly interested in experiences and states of consciousness that transcended the individual self, that pointed toward dimensions of existence beyond the personal ego. This shift was partly a natural development of his work on peak experiences. As he studied these experiences more deeply, he noticed that many of them involved a dissolution of ego boundaries, a sense of connection to something larger than oneself, a feeling of unity with all of existence. These were not just experiences of the fully actualized self, but experiences that went beyond self altogether. He began to speak of a level of need above self-actualization, which he called self-transcendence. This was the need to connect to something beyond oneself, to serve a cause or a calling larger than one's personal development, to experience unity with the cosmos, to participate in something eternal or infinite. Self-actualization, as he had originally conceived it, was about becoming fully yourself, actualizing your individual potential. But self-transcendence was about going beyond yourself, transcending the personal self to connect with larger realities. It was about service, about devotion, about losing oneself in something greater. This was not a rejection of his earlier work, but an extension of it. Self-actualization remained important. You needed to become fully yourself before you could transcend yourself. But self-actualization was not the final stage. Beyond it lay another dimension, another realm of human potential. Maslow called this realm the farther reaches of human nature, which became the title of his posthumously published book. These farther reaches included mystical experiences, cosmic consciousness, experiences of unity and oneness, profound compassion and love, transcendent aesthetic experiences, and states of being that felt sacred, eternal, or divine. He was careful to distinguish between healthy transcendence and pathological escape. Some people try to transcend the self because they had never properly developed a self in the first place. They sought merger and dissolution as an escape from the anxiety and responsibility of individuality. This was not genuine transcendence, but regression, a fleeing from selfhood rather than a going beyond it. True transcendence, in Maslow's view, required first having a strong, healthy self. You needed to have your basic needs met, to have developed ego strength and autonomy, to have actualized your individual potential. Only then could you genuinely transcend the self without losing yourself in unhealthy ways. This distinction was important because the 1,960 seconds were characterized by many forms of seeking: spiritual seeking, drug, experimentation, alternative lifestyles, communal living. Maslow appreciated the impulse behind much of this seeking, the hunger for meaning and transcendence that it expressed. But he also worried that some of it was premature, that people were trying to transcend selves they had never properly formed, or that they were using transcendent experiences as a way to avoid dealing with personal problems and responsibilities. He saw value in many different paths to transcendence: meditation, contemplative prayer, immersion in nature, creative work, service to others, psychedelic drugs, though he was cautious about these, and intense interpersonal connections could all facilitate transcendent experiences. What mattered was not the specific method, but the quality of the experience and its integration into one's life. Maslow was particularly interested in the relationship between transcendent experiences and values. He believed that in peak experiences and transcendent states, people directly perceived what he called being values or be values: truth, beauty, goodness, unity, aliveness, uniqueness, perfection, completion, justice, simplicity, elegance. These were not just subjective preferences or cultural constructs, but intrinsic features of reality that could be directly perceived in altered states of consciousness. This was a bold claim, reminiscent of Platonic philosophy with its forms or ideas that exist beyond the material world. Maslow was suggesting that values were not merely human inventions, but were woven into the fabric of existence itself, and that we could perceive them directly when our consciousness was sufficiently expanded or refined. This perspective led him to critique moral relativism and the idea that values are entirely culturally constructed. While he acknowledged cultural differences in values and recognized the role of culture in shaping moral sensibilities, he believed that there were core values that were universal, rooted in human nature and in the nature of reality itself. These values became clear in transcendent states, when the veils of cultural conditioning and ego defense fell away. In the last years of his life, Maslow was instrumental in the founding of transpersonal psychology as a distinct field. In 1968, along with Anthony Sutich and others, he helped establish the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. The new field was defined as concerned with the empirical, scientific study of and responsible implementation of the findings relevant to becoming individual and species-wide meta-needs, ultimate values, unitive consciousness, peak experiences, be values, ecstasy, mystical experience, awe, being, self-actualization, essence, bliss, wonder, ultimate meaning, transcendence of the self, spirit, oneness, cosmic awareness, individual and species-wide synergy, maximal interpersonal encounter, sacralization of everyday life, transcendental phenomena, cosmic self-humor and playfulness, maximal sensory awareness, responsiveness and expression, and related concepts, experiences, and activities. This was quite a mouthful, and it indicated the ambitious scope of the field. Transpersonal psychology aimed to integrate the insights of Western psychology with the wisdom traditions of the East and with a study of mystical and transcendent experiences. It was an attempt to develop a comprehensive psychology that included all dimensions of human experience, from the most basic biological needs to the most elevated spiritual aspirations. Maslow saw transpersonal psychology as a fourth force in psychology. The first force had been behaviorism, focused on observable behavior and learning. The second force had been psychoanalysis, focused on the unconscious and early childhood experiences. The third force was humanistic psychology, focused on growth, potential, and self-actualization. And now, transpersonal psychology would go even further, exploring the dimensions of consciousness that transcended the personal self altogether. This progression represented, in Maslow's view, and expanding understanding of human nature. Each force had contributed something valuable, but each had also been limited. Behaviorism had rigor, but ignored consciousness. Psychoanalysis had depth, but was too focused on pathology. Humanistic psychology had optimism, but had not fully explored the spiritual dimensions of existence. Transpersonal psychology would complete the picture, providing a truly comprehensive understanding of what it means to be human. Maslow never fully developed these ideas. He died in 1970, at the age of 62, of a heart attack. He had suffered from heart problems for years. The first serious attack came in 1967, and he knew he was living on borrowed time. In his final years, he worked urgently, trying to articulate his vision, to get his ideas down, to contribute what he could before time ran out. His death was a loss to the field, but his ideas continued to influence psychology, particularly humanistic and transpersonal psychology. The journal and the movement he helped found continued to develop, exploring consciousness, spirituality, and human potential through both rigorous research and experiential exploration. But even as Maslow's ideas spread and gained influence, they also attracted criticism. And to understand his legacy fully, we need to examine both the contributions and the critiques of his work. Abraham Maslow's work has been enormously influential, but it has also been criticized from multiple directions. Some of these criticisms point to real limitations in his approach. Others reflect fundamental disagreements about human nature, values, and what psychology should be. Let us explore these critiques gently, understanding them not as mere attacks, but as part of an ongoing conversation about how to understand the human experience. One major criticism concerns the scientific rigor of Maslow's work. His hierarchy of needs, while intuitively appealing, was not based on controlled experimental research. He did not conduct systematic studies that measured needs, tested the hierarchical structure, or made predictions that could be falsified. Instead, he developed a hierarchy through observation, introspection, and clinical experience. It was more a theoretical framework than an empirically derived model. When researchers did try to test the hierarchy empirically, the results were mixed. Some studies found support for the general idea that people prioritize certain needs over others. But the strict hierarchical structure, the idea that one level must be satisfied before the next emerges, did not hold up well. People often work on multiple levels simultaneously. A starving artist sacrifices physiological comfort for self-expression. A mother deprives herself to feed her children. Cultural and individual differences create different patterns of need satisfaction. Similarly, Maslow's study of self-actualizing people was methodologically problematic. His sample was small and subjectively selected. He relied heavily on biographical information and personal acquaintance. He had no control group, no objective measures, no way to ensure that his conclusions were not simply reflections of his own values and biases. The characteristics he identified in self-actualizing people might describe people he admired rather than representing a genuine psychological category. Some critics argued that his portrait of self-actualization reflected a particular cultural ideal: Western, educated, individualistic, privileged, rather than a universal human potential. The characteristics he valued, autonomy, creativity, independence, democratic values, are highly prized in liberal Western cultures, but might be less valued or differently expressed in cultures that emphasize interdependence, tradition, hierarchy, or collective harmony. This points to a deeper criticism, that Maslow's work is ethnocentric, that it universalizes a particular cultural perspective and treats it as human nature. His self-actualizing individuals are remarkably similar to the ideal of the autonomous, self-determining individual that emerged from Enlightenment philosophy and that is central to American culture. But is this really what human beings everywhere strive toward? Or is it one cultural vision among many? Anthropologists and cross-cultural psychologists have shown that concepts of self, goals, and values vary dramatically across cultures. In many societies, the individual self is not the primary locus of value and identity. Instead, people understand themselves primarily through their relationships, their roles in family and community, their position in social hierarchies. The goal of life might be to fulfill one's duties, maintain harmony, honor one's ancestors, or merge with the divine, rather than to actualize one's individual potential. From this perspective, Maslow's hierarchy and his concept of self-actualization look less like universal human nature and more like a specifically Western individualistic vision of the good life. This does not necessarily invalidate his work. One can argue that his vision captures important human potentials, even if it is culturally shaped, but it does suggest that his claims to universality are overreaching. Another criticism concerns the individualistic focus of Maslow's psychology. Self-actualization is fundamentally about individual development, individual potential, individual fulfillment. Even when Maslow spoke of transcendence and connection to something larger, the starting point was always the individual self. But human beings are social creatures. We are born into relationships. We develop within cultural contexts. Our identities are formed through our connections to others. Is it really possible or desirable to understand human development primarily in individualistic terms? Some critics argued that Maslow's emphasis on self-actualization could foster narcissism, a self-absorbed focus on personal growth and fulfillment at the expense of genuine relationships and social commitments. The human potential movement, which drew heavily on Maslow's ideas, sometimes exhibited this tendency, people endlessly working on themselves, attending workshops, exploring their feelings, but not necessarily becoming more capable of sustaining relationships, contributing to communities, or addressing social problems. Maslow himself was aware of this danger and tried to emphasize that true self-actualization involved concern for others, social interest, and contribution to something beyond oneself. But his framework did not always successfully integrate the social dimension of human existence. The hierarchy of needs places social needs, belonging, and love as intermediate rather than foundational, and self-actualization itself is defined primarily in terms of individual development rather than relational or communal flourishing. Related to this is a criticism about privilege. Self-actualization, in Maslow's scheme, depends on having one's lower needs met. You need food, shelter, safety, belonging, and esteem before you can pursue self-actualization. But most people in the world, historically and today, have not had these needs reliably met. Poverty, violence, oppression, marginalization, these realities prevent most people from reaching the higher levels of the hierarchy. Does this mean that poor people, oppressed people, people struggling for survival are not actualizing their potential, are not living fully human lives? Maslow's framework could be read this way. And critics pointed out that this is both empirically questionable and morally problematic. People facing great hardship often display remarkable creativity, wisdom, compassion, and dignity. Slaves created art and music and built communities. Peasants developed rich cultural traditions. The poor often display more generosity and mutual aid than the comfortable. Are these not expressions of human potential? Maslow would likely respond that his hierarchy describes general tendencies and that exceptions do not invalidate the pattern. But the criticism raises important questions about whether his framework adequately captures the complexity of human flourishing under diverse conditions. Another set of criticisms concerns the vagueness of some of Maslow's key concepts. What exactly is self-actualization? How do you measure it? How do you know when someone is self-actualizing? Maslow's descriptions are evocative, but they are not precise enough to permit clear operational definitions. This makes his theory difficult to test and to apply consistently. Similarly, peak experiences are described in poetic, impressionistic terms. While this captures something of their quality, it makes systematic study difficult. Are all intense positive experiences peak experiences? What distinguishes a peak experience from other kinds of intense experiences? Without clearer definitions, the concept risks becoming so broad as to be meaningless or so vague as to be unfalsifiable. Some critics from more traditional scientific perspectives argued that Maslow abandoned the rigorous methods of empirical psychology in favor of what amounted to philosophical speculation and value statements dressed up as science. He made claims about what human beings need, what they should strive for, what constitutes health and illness, but these claims were not derived from controlled experiments or large-scale studies. They reflected his values, his vision of the good life, which he then attributed to human nature. This raises fundamental questions about the relationship between science and values. Can psychology be purely descriptive, or does it inevitably involve normative judgments about how people should live? Maslow believed that science could discover values in nature, that one could empirically study what conditions lead to human flourishing and thereby derive an objective foundation for ethics. But critics argued that this confused empirical facts about what people desire or need with normative claims about what is valuable or good. From a psychoanalytic perspective, some critics saw Maslow's optimistic view of human nature as naive, as neglecting the darker aspects of the psyche. Freud had taught that human beings are driven by powerful unconscious forces, sexuality, aggression, death drives, that are often in conflict with social demands, and even with our own conscious intentions. The psyche is a battleground. Civilization requires the repression of our drives, and this repression creates discontent, neurosis, and unhappiness. Maslow rejected this tragic vision. He believed that human nature was fundamentally constructive, that our deeper impulses, when expressed in healthy ways, were positive and growth-oriented. Aggression and destructiveness, in his view, were typically responses to frustration, to unmet needs, to pathological environments, rather than inherent drives. Create healthy conditions, meet people's needs, and they would naturally move toward growth and self-actualization. But is this true? Or does it underestimate the reality of evil, the capacity for cruelty, the pleasure some people take in domination and destruction? Historical events, the Holocaust, the genocides, the tortures, The systematic cruelties that mark human history suggest that human nature includes darker potentials that cannot simply be explained as reactions to unmet needs. Maslow's framework may not adequately account for these realities. From a behaviorist perspective, critics charge that Maslow's concepts were too mentalistic, too focused on internal subjective states that could not be objectively observed or measured. Self-actualization, peak experiences, being values. These were not observable behaviors. They were inferred mental states. And behaviorists argued that psychology should study behavior, not unobservable inner experiences. By focusing on subjective phenomena, Maslow was, in their view, abandoning scientific rigor and returning psychology to the realm of introspection and speculation. There were also criticisms from existential and phenomenological perspectives. Some existentialist thinkers appreciated Maslow's emphasis on meaning, choice, and human potential, but they found his framework too optimistic, too linear, too developmental. Existentialism emphasizes the anxiety and ambiguity of human existence, the burden of radical freedom, the absurdity of a universe without inherent meaning. It does not promise that there is a natural trajectory toward self-actualization, a hierarchy of needs that will automatically lead to fulfillment if we just satisfy each level in turn. Moreover, existentialists might argue that genuine authenticity requires confronting the darker aspects of existence: death, meaninglessness, isolation, freedom rather than moving through a comfortable developmental progression. Peak experiences and transcendence might sometimes be forms of escape, ways of avoiding the hard existential realities rather than facing them. Despite all these criticisms, Maslow's work has endured and continued to influence psychology and broader culture. Why? Perhaps because it addresses something important that other approaches neglect. It provides a language for talking about human aspirations, about growth, about what life can be at its best. It offers a vision of human nature that is hopeful without being naively optimistic, that acknowledges suffering and struggle, but insists that we are capable of more than just coping with pathology. And perhaps what matters most is not whether Maslow's specific theories are scientifically validated in every detail, but whether they help us think more deeply and more humanely about our lives. Theories are tools for thinking. They are lenses through which we view reality. Maslow's theories provide a lens that highlights growth, potential, meaning, and transcendence. This lens may not capture everything about human nature, but it captures something that is easily lost in other approaches. Abraham Maslow died in 1970, but his ideas lived on, spreading through psychology, education, business, and popular culture in ways that would have been difficult to predict. The language he created, the hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, peak experiences, became part of our common vocabulary for talking about human life and potential. His most visible legacy is the hierarchy of needs. Walk into almost any introductory psychology class, any business school, any human resources department, and you will find Maslow's pyramid. It has become one of those ideas that seems obvious once you hear it. That provides an easy framework for thinking about human motivation. It is simplified, often misrepresented, sometimes reduced to a cartoon of itself, but it persists because it captures something true, that human beings have different levels of need, and that these needs have a rough ordering in terms of priority and urgency. Managers use the hierarchy to think about employee motivation. Educators use it to understand students' barriers to learning. Therapists use it to assess clients' needs. Social workers use it to prioritize interventions. The framework has proven flexible and useful across many domains, even if it is not scientifically precise. In the field of psychology, Maslow is recognized as one of the founders of humanistic psychology, often called a third force, to distinguish it from behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychology emphasizes human dignity, freedom, and potential. It focuses on the whole person, on subjective experience, on meaning and values. It insists that psychology should study not just what is wrong with people, but what is right. Not just how to fix problems, but how to facilitate growth. This perspective profoundly influenced the development of therapies. Carl Rogers, a contemporary and friend of Maslow, developed person-centered therapy based on humanistic principles. Fritz Perls created Gestalt therapy. Rollo May brought existential psychology to America. These and other therapies emphasize the client's capacity for self-direction, the importance of the therapeutic relationship, the goal of personal growth rather than just symptom reduction. Maslow's influence extended into educational theory through progressive and humanistic education movements. If self-actualization is the highest human need, then education should facilitate it. Schools should not just transmit information or train students for jobs. They should help young people discover their potentials, develop their capacities, become fully themselves. This vision influenced alternative schools, experiential learning approaches, and educational philosophies that emphasized creativity, autonomy, and personal meaning. In organizational psychology and management theory, Maslow's ideas contributed to approaches that emphasized human relations, employee development, and organizational culture. The recognition that people need more than just paychecks, that they need safety, belonging, esteem, and opportunities for meaningful work led to changes in management practices. Quality circles, team-based work, participatory management, organizational development, all these drew in part on humanistic principles that Maslow articulated. The human potential movement of the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds drew heavily on Maslow's work. Encounter groups, sensitivity training, personal growth workshops, the exploration of consciousness through various methods. All of these reflected a belief that human beings have vast, untapped potentials that can be realized through experiential methods and supportive environments. Institutions like the Esalen Institute became centers for exploring these ideas, bringing together psychologists, spiritual teachers, body workers, artists, and seekers of all kinds. This movement had mixed results. It generated valuable innovations in therapy, education, and personal development. It encouraged people to question convention, to explore their inner lives, to take responsibility for their own growth. But it also sometimes descended into narcissism, anti-intellectualism, and a kind of therapeutic consumerism, where people endlessly sought the next workshop or technique that would transform them. Maslow himself, as we have noted, had ambivalence about some aspects of the movement. He appreciated the emphasis on growth and potential, but worried about excesses. Still, his work provided much of the theoretical foundation and language for the movement. In the realm of positive psychology, a field that emerged in the late 1990 seconds Under the leadership of Martin Seligman and others, Maslow is recognized as an important predecessor. Positive psychology explicitly studies positive emotions, character strengths, and conditions that enable individuals and communities to flourish. This is very much in the spirit of Maslow's call to study health rather than illness, to focus on what enables human beings to thrive. Positive psychology has been more rigorous in its research methods than humanistic psychology often was, conducting large-scale studies, using validated measures, and testing hypotheses systematically. But the fundamental orientation, the focus on well-being, meaning, optimal functioning, owes much to Maslow's vision. Beyond psychology proper, Maslow's ideas have influenced fields as diverse as nursing, social work, architecture, consumer behavior, and marketing. Whenever someone talks about meeting people's needs, about creating environments that support human flourishing, about helping people realize their potential, they're often implicitly or explicitly drawing on Maslow's framework. In popular culture, self-actualization became a widely recognized concept, sometimes used seriously, sometimes ironically or critically. The very idea that we should actualize ourselves, that we have a responsibility to become all that we can be, that personal growth and development are important life goals. These notions are now deeply embedded in Western, and particularly American, culture. We cannot attribute this entirely to Maslow, but he provided a psychological vocabulary and legitimacy for these values. His work also influenced spiritual and religious movements, particularly those seeking to integrate psychology and spirituality. The transpersonal psychology movement that he helped found continues to explore the interface between psychological development and spiritual growth. Many contemporary spiritual teachers draw on psychological frameworks, including Maslow's, to articulate their teachings. The concept of peak experiences provided a naturalistic account of mystical and transcendent experiences that appealed to people who were spiritual but not religious, who wanted access to the sacred without traditional religious frameworks. This contributed to the development of what is now sometimes called spiritual but not religious identity, an increasingly common orientation in contemporary Western society. At the same time, Maslow's legacy includes the critiques and limitations we have discussed. The recognition that his work reflected particular cultural values and biases, that it neglected some dimensions of human experience, that it was not always scientifically rigorous, these too are part of his legacy. They remind us to engage with theories critically, to recognize their historical and cultural contexts, to see them as partial perspectives rather than complete truths. Perhaps the most important aspect of Maslow's legacy is not any specific theory, but a general orientation toward human nature. He insisted that psychology should study not just problems but possibilities, not just pathology but potential. He believed that human beings have an inherent tendency toward growth and self-realization when conditions allow. He thought that meaning, values, and transcendence were proper subjects for scientific study rather than being relegated to religion or philosophy. This orientation, optimistic but not naive, holistic, humanistic, concerned with a full range of human experience, from the biological to the spiritual, continues to influence how many people think about psychology and human nature. It offers an alternative to purely mechanistic or reductionistic views, insisting that human beings are more than machines, more than bundles of conditioned responses, more than the sum of our pathologies. Whether or not his specific theories are correct in all details, Maslow succeeded in asking important questions and insisting that psychology address the full spectrum of human experience. His work reminds us that science need not be cold or reductionistic, that we can study subjective experience, values, and meaning without abandoning rigor, that understanding human beings requires attending to what is best and highest in us, as well as what is damaged or disordered. Let us pause now and consider the trajectory of a life, the arc of a mind developing over decades. Abraham Maslow began as a lonely, anxious child in Brooklyn, feeling unloved and inadequate. He retreated into books, into the life of the mind, seeking in ideas what he could not find in human warmth. This was his wound, the source of his pain, but also the source of his questions. Because he has suffered from unmet needs, he could understand what needs are. Because he had felt rejected, he could appreciate the importance of love and belonging. Because he has struggled with self-esteem, he could recognize how crucial it is to feel valued. His personal pain became the foundation for his professional insight. The wounded healer, the classic archetype, Maslow embodied it. His intellectual journey followed a certain logic. He began with animal research, studying primates, observing dominance hierarchies. This was safe, concrete, acceptable in the scientific community. But his attention was always moving upward, from behavior to motivation, from observable actions to inner experience, from deficiency to growth. He encountered mentors and colleagues who expanded his vision. Gestalt psychology taught him to think about wholes rather than parts, about insight and understanding rather than just conditioned responses. Cultural anthropology showed him that human nature was more flexible and varied than he had imagined. Contact with refugees from Europe, brilliant minds fleeing fascism, demonstrated both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human cruelty. The war years were crucial. Watching the world tear itself apart, Maslow felt a sense of urgency. Psychology needed to contribute to human welfare, to peace, to the prevention of such catastrophes. But how? By understanding what makes people healthy, what enables them to realize their better nature, what conditions facilitate growth and creativity and cooperation rather than destructiveness. This led him to study excellence, to investigate self-actualizing people. What did they have in common? What could we learn from studying the best of humanity rather than the worst? This was a radical methodological move. Psychology had always studied problems, pathology, what went wrong. Maslow insisted on studying what went right, and what he found was hopeful. Self-actualizing people were not superhuman, not saints, not perfect. But they were functioning well. They were creative, autonomous, compassionate, engaged with life. They had peak experiences, moments of transcendence and joy. They were, in many ways, what human beings could be under favorable conditions. This discovery shaped the second half of his career. He articulated a vision of humanistic psychology, a third force that would balance behaviorism and psychoanalysis with a focus on growth, meaning, and potential. He applied his ideas to organizations, to education, to social reform. He reached toward the transpersonal, toward the farther reaches of human nature, toward the mystical and transcendent dimensions of consciousness. Throughout this journey, there is a coherent thread. Maslow was always asking, what do human beings need to flourish? What is our nature at its best? How can we create conditions that allow more people to realize their potential? These are not just scientific questions, but moral and even spiritual ones. They arise from a vision of what human life can and should be. His answers were shaped by his culture, by his time, by his personal history. They reflect American values of individualism, freedom, self-determination. They reflect the optimism of mid-20th century liberal humanism, the belief in progress, the faith that human nature is fundamentally good and that problems arise mainly from bad environments rather than inherent flaws. These are not universal or eternal truths. They are a particular perspective, valuable but partial. Other cultures, other times, other experiences would yield different insights, but that does not make Maslow's contribution less important. Every thinker is situated, every theory is partial, every vision is shaped by its context. What matters is whether the vision illuminates something, whether it helps us see more clearly, think more deeply, live more fully. Maslow's vision illuminates the human capacity for growth, for transcendence, for meaning. It reminds us that we are not just biological machines or bundles of conditioned responses or seething cauldrons of unconscious drives. We are also beings capable of love, creativity, wisdom, and self-transcendence. We have needs, yes, but the highest need is to become what we have the potential to become, to realize the best possibilities within us. This is an inspiring vision, and inspiration matters. Ideas that inspire us, that call us toward our better selves, that help us imagine what we might become. These are valuable, even if they are not perfectly accurate, even if they require qualification and critique. They are North Stars, not precise maps. They show us a direction, even if the terrain is more complex than they suggest. As we move deeper into the night, as sleep draws closer, let us hold this vision gently. Let us appreciate what Maslow offered, a psychology of hope, of growth, of human possibility, while also remaining aware of its limitations and blind spots. Let us take what is valuable, question what is questionable, and continue the conversation that he began. For that is what great thinkers do. They do not provide final answers, but open questions. They do not close conversations, but initiate them. And the conversation that Maslow initiated about human needs, about growth and self-actualization, about peak experiences and transcendence, about what we might become at our best, that conversation continues. Now, in this quiet hour, let us consider what we might take from Maslow's work into our own lives. How might his insights guide us? What practical wisdom emerges from his theories? First, there is the recognition of needs. We need food, shelter, safety. We need to belong, to be connected to others, to have relationships that matter. We need esteem, both from others and from ourselves. These are not luxuries or preferences. They are requirements. If we neglect them, we suffer. If we deny them in ourselves or others, we create problems. This seems obvious, perhaps, but our culture often obscures it. We are told to be self-sufficient, to not need anyone, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But this is mythology. Human beings are interdependent. We need each other. We need community. We need to belong. Recognizing this is not weakness, but wisdom. Similarly, we are often told that our worth depends on our achievements, our productivity, our success. But Maslow reminds us that We need esteem and recognition not just as rewards for accomplishment, but as fundamental requirements for psychological health. A child needs to be valued for who they are, not just for what they do. An adult needs respect, needs to feel competent, needs to have their dignity acknowledged. These needs are real and legitimate. Second, there is the call to move beyond deficiency. Much of our life is spent trying to fill lacks, trying to get what we do not have. We are hungry, so we seek food. We are lonely, so we seek connection. We feel inadequate, so we seek esteem. This is natural and necessary. But Maslow invites us to imagine something more, to imagine a life organized not around filling deficiencies, but around growth and self-actualization. What would it mean to live from a place of abundance rather than scarcity? To act not because we lack something, but because we are expressing what we are. To create not to gain recognition, but because creativity is part of our nature. To love not to get love back, but because loving is who we are. This shift from deficiency motivation to growth motivation is subtle but profound. It is the difference between constantly trying to fix ourselves and allowing ourselves to unfold, to blossom, to become. It is the difference between a life of endless striving and a life of expressive being. Third, there is the invitation to discover our unique potential. Self-actualization is not a single destination, but a unique path for each person. What are your talents? What are your passions? What calls to you? What feels like your work to do in the world? These are not trivial questions. They are questions about your nature, about who you are meant to become. Modern life often pressures us toward conventional paths, toward conformity, toward doing what is expected or profitable rather than what is meaningful. Maslow's work reminds us that true fulfillment comes from being ourselves, from actualizing our specific potentials, not from conforming to others' expectations or society's norms. This requires courage. It requires listening to yourself, to your inner nature, even when it diverges from external demands. It requires taking responsibility for your own life, making choices that are authentic rather than simply expected. It is easier to follow a prescribed path, but it is more fulfilling to walk your own. Fourth, there is the value of peak experiences. These moments of heightened awareness, of transcendence, of connection to something larger. They are not rare mystical events available only to saints and mystics. They are natural human experiences available to all of us. A moment watching a sunset, a moment of deep connection with another person, a moment of creative flow, a moment when beauty or truth or love feels overwhelming. These experiences matter. They are not just pleasant interludes, but glimpses of what life can be. Evidence that existence is fundamentally good. Reminders of what we are living for. We should cultivate opportunities for such experiences. We should be open to them. We should create conditions in our lives through nature, art, relationships, creative work, spiritual practice that make them more likely. Fifth, there is the recognition that psychological health depends on social conditions. You cannot self-actualize if you are starving or living in constant danger. You cannot realize your potential if your basic needs are chronically unmet. This means that individual well-being and social justice are connected. If we want human beings to flourish, we must create societies that provide safety, opportunity, community, and respect for all people. This is not just an ethical imperative, but a psychological one. A society that leaves many people struggling at the level of basic survival is a society that wastes human potential, that prevents many of its members from developing and contributing what they might. From Maslow's perspective, social reform and individual development are two sides of the same coin. Sixth, there is the vision of transcendence, of going beyond self. Self-actualization is important, but it is not the end. Beyond becoming fully yourself lies the possibility of transcending yourself, of connecting to something larger, of serving purposes beyond your personal development. This might be devotion to a cause, commitment to others, connection to the divine, or simply moments of losing yourself in something that matters. This transcendence is not a rejection of self, but a completion of it. You must become yourself before you can go beyond yourself. But once you have become yourself, there is more a dimension of existence that is transpersonal, that connects you to the larger whole, that gives life ultimate meaning. Seventh, there is the encouragement to study excellence, to focus on what is right rather than only on what is wrong. In our own lives, this means paying attention to our strengths, to moments when we are functioning well, to experiences of flow and fulfillment. Rather than constantly focusing on our problems and deficits, we can also notice and cultivate our potentials and successes. In our relationships, it means seeing and appreciating what is good in others, rather than only criticizing their flaws. In our social thinking, it means asking not just what is wrong with society, but what is right, what works, what enables people to flourish. This does not mean ignoring problems or being naively optimistic. It means balance, means attending to the full spectrum of human experience, including the positive. Eighth, there is the recognition of the sacred in ordinary life. Peak experiences, being values, transcendent moments. These show us that the sacred is not separate from ordinary existence, but woven through it. A meal shared with friends, work that engages your talents, a walk in nature, a moment of honest connection, these can be sacred. The distinction between secular and sacred dissolves when we recognize that meaning, beauty, truth, and goodness are present in everyday life if we have eyes to see them. Finally, there is the permission to be human, to be imperfect, to be in process. Self-actualization is not a state you achieve and then maintain forever. It is a direction, a movement, a process of becoming. There will be setbacks, regressions, failures. There will be times when you are caught at lower levels of need, times when survival or safety or belonging consumes your attention. This is normal. This is human. The path to self-actualization is not straight or smooth. It is winding. It involves detours and backtracking. What matters is the general direction, the overall movement toward growth and fulfillment over a lifetime. Be patient with yourself. Be compassionate with yourself. Becoming yourself takes time. These insights, drawn from Maslow's work, are practical wisdom. They are not abstract theories, but guides for living. They invite us to pay attention to our needs, to move toward growth, to cultivate peak experiences, to develop our unique potentials, to connect to something larger than ourselves, to create social conditions that enable flourishing, to appreciate what is right, as well as addressing what is wrong. And perhaps most fundamentally, they invite us to believe in human potential, to trust that there is something in human nature that moves toward the good when conditions allow, to have faith that we are capable of more than we often achieve, to hold a vision of what we and others might become at our best. This vision is Maslow's gift to us. Whether or not we accept every detail of his theories, we can receive this gift with gratitude and allow it to inform how we live. In the final years of his life, Abraham Maslow knew that time was running out. His first serious heart attack came in 1967, at the age of 59. It was severe enough that he and his doctors understood it as a warning. His heart was damaged. He had to slow down, to be careful, to recognize his physical limitations. For a man who had always been driven, who had so much he wanted to accomplish, this was difficult. There were still ideas to develop, books to write, conversations to have. He felt urgency. He worked with a kind of fierce intensity, trying to get his thoughts down, to articulate his vision while he still could. During this period, he moved to California, accepting a fellowship at the Laughlin Institute in Menlo Park. The move west was partly for health reasons. The California climate was gentler than New York, but also because California in the late 1960s was the center of the human potential movement, and Maslow wanted to be part of that ferment of ideas. He continued to write. He worked on what would become The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, a collection of papers and essays that explored transpersonal psychology, transcendent experiences, and the implications of his work for values in society. He was reaching towards something, trying to articulate a vision that went beyond his earlier work on self-actualization. There was a quality of spiritual urgency in his late writing. He was not content with a psychology that stopped at individual fulfillment. He wanted to understand how individuals connected to something larger, how personal development opened onto transpersonal dimensions, how psychology could encompass the sacred and transcendent aspects of human experience. He was also more explicitly concerned with values and with what he called a scientific ethics. He believed that science could discover values inherent in human nature and in reality itself, that we did not have to choose between objective science and subjective values. This was a bold claim, and he knew it was controversial, but he felt it was important. He was trying to heal the split between facts and values, between science and the humanities, between the empirical and the normative. His relationships during this period were significant. He maintained friendships with many of the leading figures in humanistic and transpersonal psychology. He corresponded widely. He mentored younger scholars. He was building not just a body of ideas, but a movement, a community of people who shared his vision of what psychology could be. But he was also increasingly critical of certain trends in the human potential movement. He worried about anti-intellectualism, about the rejection of rigorous thinking in favor of pure experience or feeling. He worried about narcissism and self-indulgence, about people using the language of growth and self-actualization to justify selfishness or to avoid responsibility. He worried about the movement's tendency toward fads and gimmicks, toward quick fixes and magical thinking. He wanted the movement to be more grounded, more serious, more committed to genuine development, rather than just feel-good experiences. He believed in human potential, but he also believed that realizing that potential required discipline, commitment, hard work. It was not enough to attend a workshop or have a peak experience. One had to integrate those experiences into one's life, to live them, to allow them to transform how one actually behaved in the world. His health continued to decline. He had another heart attack. He was often tired. The physical vitality that had sustained his intense intellectual work was ebbing. But he kept writing, kept thinking, kept trying to articulate his vision. On the 8th of June 1970, Abraham Maslow died of a massive heart attack while jogging near his home in California. He was 62 years old. His wife Bertha, his companion and supporter throughout his adult life, survived him. Their 2 daughters survived him. And his ideas, still developing, still incomplete, survived him and continued to grow and influence. His death was mourned in the psychological community and beyond. Memorial services were held, tributes were written. His colleagues and students spoke of his generosity, his curiosity, his courage in pursuing unconventional ideas, his fundamental decency and warmth as a person. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute was the continuation of his work. The journals he helped found continued to publish. The transpersonal psychology movement continued to develop. His books continued to be read, to inspire new generations of students and thinkers. His ideas continue to spread through psychology, education, business, and culture. In a sense, his death was not an ending, but a transition. His personal life ended, but his intellectual life continued through those who engaged with his ideas, who applied them, who critiqued them, who built upon them. This is the kind of immortality that thinkers achieve, not literal survival, but influence, legacy, the continuation of conversations they began. As we move toward the close of this long night's contemplation, let us consider the deepest questions that Maslow's work raises, the fundamental issues about human nature and human life that his theories address. What are we? What is human nature? This is the question beneath all of psychology, the question that every theory tries to answer. Maslow's answer was complex and evolved over time, but its core remained consistent. We are beings who have needs arranged in a hierarchy, who are capable of growth and self-actualization, who can transcend ourselves to connect with something larger. We are not just biological machines, not just stimulus response mechanisms, not just seething masses of unconscious drives. We are all of these things, but we are also more. We are capable of love, creativity, insight, moral action, transcendent experience. We can become aware of ourselves, make choices, pursue meaning, actualize our potentials. We are, in a word, both creature and creator, both determined and free. This is a hopeful vision, but it is not naively optimistic. Maslow recognized that human beings often fail to realize their potential, that we are capable of cruelty and destructiveness, that suffering and frustration are real, but he insisted that these negative aspects are not our essential nature. They are distortions, reactions to unmet needs, products of unhealthy environments. Given favorable conditions, safety, love, respect, opportunity, human nature tends toward growth and goodness. Is this true? It is an empirical question, and the evidence is mixed. Human history shows both remarkable altruism and horrifying cruelty. Individuals display both generous compassion and selfish indifference. Perhaps the truth is that human nature has multiple potentials, and which ones manifest depends on conditions, choices, culture, and the complex interplay of factors that shape development. But even if we cannot prove that human nature is essentially good, there is value in approaching people as though they have positive potential. Expectation shapes reality. If we treat people as though they are capable of growth, If we create conditions that support their development, they are more likely to flourish than if we treat them as inherently flawed or dangerous. In this sense, Maslow's optimistic anthropology may be not just a description, but a prescription, a way of engaging with people that helps call forth their better nature. What do we need? Maslow's hierarchy provides an answer. Physiological needs, safety, love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization, and transcendence. But is this list complete? Is it accurate? Are these needs universal or culturally specific? Different thinkers have proposed different lists of basic needs. Some emphasize autonomy, some emphasize relatedness, some emphasize competence. Some argue that the need for meaning is fundamental, not derivable from other needs. Some insist that social connection is more basic than Maslow placed it, foundational rather than intermediate. Perhaps there is no single correct list. Perhaps different people have different fundamental needs, or the same needs in different priorities. Perhaps needs themselves are partly socially constructed, shaped by culture and personal history. But even if Maslow's specific hierarchy is not exactly right, the general insight remains valuable. We have multiple levels of need, some more urgent than others. And understanding these needs is crucial for understanding motivation and well-being. What is the good life? What does it mean to live well, to flourish as a human being? For Maslow, the answer centers on self-actualization, becoming fully yourself, actualizing your potentials, living authentically and creatively, having deep relationships, contributing to something beyond yourself, having peak experiences, developing your capacities. This is an appealing vision, but it raises questions. Is self-actualization really the highest good? What about wisdom? About virtue? About service? What about simply being a good person, fulfilling your responsibilities, treating others with kindness? Do you have to be creative, autonomous, and peak experiencing to live well? Perhaps self-actualization is one form of the good life, but not the only one. Perhaps there are multiple ways to flourish, different patterns of a life well lived. A mother who devotes herself to raising her children with love and wisdom, a teacher who inspires students, a craftsman who takes pride in excellent work, a friend who is reliably present. Are these not living well? Even if they never self-actualize in Maslow's specific sense, Maslow would likely say yes, that self-actualization takes different forms for different people. But his framework sometimes seems to privilege certain kinds of lives, autonomous, creative, individualistic, over others. This is a limitation worth noting. What is our relationship to the transcendent? Maslow insisted that peak experiences and transcendent states are natural human capacities, not supernatural intrusions. Mystical experience, oceanic feelings, cosmic consciousness. These are part of our nature, accessible through various means. This naturalizing of the spiritual is both liberating and problematic. It is liberating because it makes transcendent experience available to everyone, not just religious believers or mystics. You do not need to accept particular doctrines or belong to particular institutions to access these dimensions of consciousness. You can have them through nature, art, relationships, meditation, creative work, or simply moments of grace. But it is problematic because it potentially reduces the transcendent to psychology. Is a peak experience really an encounter with the divine? Or is it just a particular brain state? Is the sense of unity with all things a genuine perception of reality, or is it an illusion created by the dissolution of ordinary ego boundaries? These questions remain contested. Maslow believed that being values, truth, beauty, goodness, unity are real features of existence that we perceive in peak experiences, not just subjective feelings. This is a bold metaphysical claim. It suggests that values are woven into the fabric of reality, that they exist objectively and can be known through experience. This is closer to Platonic philosophy or mystical traditions than to scientific materialism. Whether or not this claim is true, it points to something important: the human need for meaning, for connection to something larger than ourselves, for a sense that our lives and our world are not merely random or meaningless, but have intrinsic value. Even if we cannot prove that values exist objectively, we seem to need to experience them as real, as grounded in something beyond mere preference. Maslow's work honors this need. How should we organize society? This question follows from Maslow's emphasis on the social conditions necessary for self-actualization. If human beings flourish only when their needs are met, then society has a responsibility to create conditions that allow needs to be met. This implies a certain kind of politics, progressive, social democratic, focused on providing safety nets, ensuring basic welfare, reducing inequality, creating opportunities for meaningful work and community participation. Maslow was not primarily a political thinker, and he did not work out the political implications of his theory in detail. But his framework suggests that a good society is one that facilitates human flourishing by meeting needs and supporting development. This is very different from political philosophies that emphasize only freedom from interference or that see individuals as radically self-sufficient. At the same time, Maslow's emphasis on autonomy, creativity, and individual self-actualization reflects liberal political values. He was suspicious of collectivism, of systems that submerged individuals in the group, of ideologies that demanded conformity. He believed in individual freedom and responsibility. But he also recognized that individuals need supportive social structures to exercise that freedom productively. Perhaps the political implication is a balance. Strong enough social provisions to ensure that basic needs are met, combined with enough freedom and opportunity for individuals to develop their unique potentials. This is easier to state than to achieve, of course. The tension between social provision and individual freedom, between equality and excellence, between support and autonomy, remains a central challenge of political philosophy. Finally, the deepest question: what are we for? What is the purpose of human existence? Why are we here? Maslow did not answer this in religious terms. He did not appeal to God's plan or to supernatural purpose. But he did suggest that we have an internal nature that seeks expression, that we are called to become ourselves, to actualize our potential. This is purpose without an external purposer. It is teleology, the idea that we have an end or goal, but naturalized, grounded in our own nature rather than imposed from outside. We are here to become what we are capable of becoming. This is both our deepest need and our highest calling. This answer may satisfy some people and leave others dissatisfied. Those who seek purpose in relationship to God, to a cosmic plan, to something definitively beyond nature, may find Maslow's answer insufficient. But for those who seek a naturalistic account of purpose, who want to ground meaning in human nature and human potential rather than in theological claims, Maslow's vision offers a compelling option. The night grows deep. The world outside is silent. In this quiet darkness, we have journeyed through the life and thought of Abraham Maslow, his painful childhood, his intellectual development, his revolutionary ideas about human needs and potential, his study of self-actualizing people and peak experiences, his vision of humanistic and transpersonal psychology, his influence on culture and society, and the ongoing conversation his work initiated. What do we take from this journey? What do we carry with us as we move towards sleep? Perhaps it is simply this: the reminder that we are beings of need and possibility, that we require certain conditions to flourish, but that we are capable of remarkable development when those conditions are met. The reminder that psychology need not be limited to studying pathology, but can investigate health, excellence, and transcendence. The reminder that meaning and purpose are real aspects of human life, worthy of serious study and cultivation. Maslow was not a perfect thinker. His theories were not flawless. His cultural assumptions shaped his work in ways he did not fully recognize. His research methods were not always rigorous. His vision of human nature, while inspiring, may be too optimistic, too individualistic, too Western. But he offered something valuable: a psychology of hope, of growth, of human possibility. In a century marked by world wars, genocide, and unprecedented suffering, in a discipline often focused on what goes wrong with people, he insisted on also studying what goes right. He asked us to consider what we might become at our best, not just what we are at our worst. This vision has limitations, but it also has power. It has inspired millions of people to think about their own potential, to pursue growth, to seek meaning. It has influenced how we think about education, about work, about relationships, about spirituality. It has become part of our cultural vocabulary for discussing human life. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is what it can ask of a thinker, not that they have all the answers, not that their theories are perfect, but that they open new ways of seeing, new questions to ask, new possibilities to explore, that they add something valuable to our ongoing conversation about what it means to be human. As you lie in the darkness, your breathing slowing, your thoughts softening, let Maslow's vision drift through your mind like a gentle dream. The pyramid of needs, rising from basic physical requirements to the heights of self-actualization and transcendence. The self-actualizing people, living with autonomy and creativity and deep connection. The peak experiences, moments when life opens up to reveal its beauty and meaning. The belief that human beings are capable of growth, of goodness, of realizing their potential. These ideas are not just abstract theories. They are invitations to a certain way of being in the world. They invite you to pay attention to your needs, to honor them, to create conditions in your life that allow them to be met. They invite you to move beyond merely filling deficiencies and toward actualizing your unique potential. They invite you to be open to transcendent experiences, to moments of beauty and connection and meaning. They invite you to believe in your capacity for growth, for becoming more fully yourself. You do not have to accept everything Maslow said to receive these invitations. You can take what resonates, question what does not, integrate his insights with other perspectives and your own experience. Ideas are tools, lenses, ways of seeing. Use them as they are useful. Modify them as needed. Discard them when they no longer serve. But do consider this. What are your needs? Are they being met? What would it mean for you to move towards self-actualization, to become more fully yourself? What are your unique gifts, your particular potentials? What calls to you? What work feels like yours to do? When have you experienced peak moments, times when you felt fully alive, connected to something larger? How might you create more opportunities for such experiences? These are not questions to answer tonight in this drowsy state. They are questions to carry with you, to live with, to let unfold over time. Self-actualization is not a destination, but a direction. Not an achievement, but a process. It is the work of a lifetime, undertaken one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment at a time. And remember, too, Maslow's larger vision that individual development and social conditions are interconnected. You cannot fully actualize your potential in isolation or in a society that does not meet basic needs. Your flourishing depends partly on others' flourishing. The good life is not just personal, but communal. Not just individual, but social. As you work to become yourself, consider also how to contribute to a world that allows more people to meet their needs and realize their potentials. But these are thoughts for another day. Now, in this deep night, it is enough to rest in the ideas we have explored, to let them settle into the quiet places of your mind, to allow them to do whatever work they will do as you sleep. Abraham Maslow's journey is complete. He was born in Brooklyn in 1908, suffered a difficult childhood, found refuge in books and ideas, developed revolutionary theories about human needs and potential, influenced psychology and culture in profound ways, and died in California in 1970 at the age of 62. His life was finite, bounded by time and circumstance. But his ideas continue, living in all who engage with them, evolving through ongoing conversations, shaping how we think about being human. Your journey continues. You carry forward what resonates from his work, combining it with other influences, other experiences, other insights. You are a unique person with unique potentials, living in specific circumstances, facing particular challenges and opportunities. Maslow's hierarchy and his vision of self-actualization are not prescriptions, but tools, frameworks that might help you understand yourself and make choices that move you toward flourishing. The night is very deep now. The words are slowing, softening, fading like stars at dawn. The story of Abraham Maslow has been told, his ideas explored, his legacy considered. The long journey through psychology lore is coming to its close. Rest now. Let your mind drift. Let the ideas settle where they will. Let sleep come gently, naturally, like breathing, like waves on a shore, like darkness deepening. You are a being of needs and possibilities. You are capable of growth, of creativity, of transcendence. You are, in Maslow's words, capable of becoming everything you have the potential to become. This is not a burden, but a blessing, not a demand, but an invitation. Tomorrow is another day, another chance to live, to grow, to move toward what calls you. But tonight, just rest, just be, just allow yourself to float in the quiet, darkness, held by the earth, surrounded by silence, drifting toward sleep. The hierarchy of needs fades into dream. The self-actualizing people dissolve into the night. The peak experiences become distant lights, beautiful but far away. And you, the listener, the traveler, through these ideas, you are simply yourself, breathing in the darkness, present in this moment, complete as you are. Thank you for this journey through the life and work of Abraham Maslow. Thank you for your attention, your patience, your willingness to explore these ideas in the deep night. May his vision of human potential inspire you. May his emphasis on growth and meaning guide you. May his belief in what we can become at our best call you forward. But for now, just rest. The night holds you. The darkness is gentle. Sleep comes like a friend, like a blessing, like grace. Good night, my friend. Good night.